Hi. Today I'm going to talk about, explain and demonstrate three different versions of the same module, the ARP 2500 Sample and Hold Module 1036. The three versions are the Behringer hardware, Voltage Modular's software version, and the G2500 version, also software, but with switches instead of patch cables, like with the original ARP 2500 from 1970. And I'm going to show and talk about how and how not to use randomness in modular improvisations and modular compositions. After all, the 1036 is called Random Voltage Module, isn't it? Well, but first of all, click the like button and subscribe to my channel, and click the bell and share this video on your social media, and buy me a coffee by clicking the donate link below. Thank you for doing all of this. Let's get going at last. I suppose there's hardly anybody out there who really doesn't know anything about sample and hold units. And what's more, there are legions of videos explaining sample and hold on the internet. Nevertheless, I'm probably supposed to explain sample and hold functionality in this video as well. Alright then, but let me do it in a more entertaining way. You might discover some aspects which you won't have expected though. Let me start using an optical equivalent to our sample and hold modules, rice, and a stupid children's toy. I'm going to pour these cornflakes onto this baking tray here, and while I'm doing so, there is a second camera taking photos at a certain rate in series. And I'll do this more than only once at different rates of the camera who is shooting the photos. All right, let's go for it. You see, the result is completely random. There's no recognizable structure in the development from one photograph to the next one. This is the optical equivalent to using white noise as a source with sample and hold units. And don't worry, I'm going to turn my attention to the module 1036 in a minute. But is there also an optical equivalent to using certain waves or sequencer-generated voltages as sources for sample and hold units? Yes, there is. This stupid children's toy is a perfect sine wave generator or simulator. And now I'm doing the same. I'm going to do the same as with the cornflakes. There's once again a second camera, and this second camera is taking pictures at a certain photos at a certain rate, and I'll use different rates for doing so. And now it makes a big difference at which rates the camera has taken the photographs. Depending on the relation between the time the carousel needs to complete one circle and the rate of taking photographs, the pictures show a forward movement, according to what we saw in the film, or a jumping to and fro at other speeds of the shooting camera, or even the illusion of a backwards movement. That's what I called tamed randomness, which is quite an important strategy, not only in producing generative music, as I'm going to show a bit later in this video. Let's change the scenery and enter the world of sonic events. Let's replace camera and carousel by sound files, control voltage, and the module 1036. The sample source goes in the jack called external in. Here the sonic flakes, the sonic cornflakes, and carousels and waves from oscillators and whole songs, if you like. For example, from a tape player, all kinds of sounds and control voltages are fed into the module in the jack called external in. Instead of using external sources, we can use the internal noise generator, or we can use both, an external source plus the internal noise source, and adjust the share of each of these two using the attenuator knobs. The camera which shoots the photographs, meaning which samples the sources mix at certain rates, sits inside the module, and the clock rate of shooting these photographs, of taking these samples, is set either by the clock frequency knob and switch on top of or at the top of the module, or by an external clock generator. The share of both can be adjusted using the attenuator knob. The external clock generator can be a square, can be a pulse wave, an upflank of a gate signal, and a lot more. I will talk about more details later in this video. I can initiate a sample even manually by pushing the little red button. At the output jack, the module delivers voltage, respectively a series of voltages, mostly used as a control volt or as control voltages to modulate things like pitch or cut-off frequency at the other modules according to the taken sample. Let's deal with some details now. What is sampled by the unit? A frequency or a volume or a sound, a timbre? Well, it's the level of the sample source at the time of sampling, of taking these photographs. And level means voltage. Sometimes you hear someone telling that the decibel of the source is sampled at a certain time, but that's not the real truth. It's the voltage level. Because it's the voltage and its changes what, for example, oscillator modules generate voltage which is turned to volume in amplifier circuitry and in speakers and so on a lot later in the signal flow. Each level of voltage corresponds to a certain level of volume, of pitch and of dB, decibel, and so on. It's not at all frequency or timbre or whatever what is sampled. Not at all, but for... Okay, well, later. Anyway, our sample and hold units take these levels from the source and hand them over to their outputs, where they stay unchanged until the next sample is taken, the next photograph is shot. Everything that happens to the source between two consecutive samples, two consecutive photographs, stays unmentioned at the output of the sample and hold module. It gets lost in the nirvana of modular synthesis. How poetical. I sent the output signal of an LFO. I use this neutron LFO, and send this signal to an attenuator. From the attenuator to a multiple, from the multiple to my oscilloscope here to control the voltage, the peak-to-peak voltage, and as well from here to the external input of the sample and hold unit, and the output of the sample and hold unit I use to modulate the oscillator module 1004. So once again, LFO, attenuator, multiple, from there two ways, one to the oscilloscope, one to the sample and hold unit, where my LFO signal here serves as signal source, as source for the sample and hold unit, where the samples are taken from. Please watch this voltage meter, peak-to-peak voltage on the oscilloscope, what shows the output level of the LFO, which the output level that reaches the sample and hold unit. So it's indeed the output level which leaves this attenuator here. Please watch this peak-to-peak voltage while I am turning this knob. So I switch on the sound. And now compare the peak-to-peak voltage, the output level, and the pitches of the random sound you get. So I turn the attenuator completely up to its maximum range of 15 volts peak to peak, and you hear I get the full pitch range, no, not pitch range, the full range of possible pitches from the lowest to the highest one. And while turning down the attenuator here, reducing the peak-to-peak voltage, I limit the possible pitch range, or the range of possible pitches to be exactly, and tame the randomness this way. This is a nice range. Melodic. All right. You will have noticed that I replaced the LFO by an external noise generator in this last example, but the principle of limiting the range of possible pitches, or of limiting the range of possible levels at the output of the sample and hold unit, this principle is valid with any kind of sample source, of course. But let the LFO come to its right now. I'm going to use the LFO to demonstrate another way of taming randomness to a musically sensible degree, and to impose at least a bit of recognizable structure on the goings-on, on the otherwise and still random goings-on. The method I'm talking about is choosing certain wave shapes as sources to take the samples from. Let's start with a saw wave, an upward ramp here, you see it. Depending on the relation LFO cycle length, called here LFO rate, and sample and hold clock rate here, we get more or less regular patterns from arpeggio-like developments which follow the upward strength of the saw wave over more irregular sequences to arpeggios which go down as if the saw wave was running backwards, quite similar to my optical example with a children's toy. So let me change the rate of the LFO and the clock rate here from time to time. Going down. That's a nice way. Yes, so the arpeggio starts with higher and higher pitches. Now it's going down again, going up. This is the starting pitch. Now I change. Make the time between taking two consecutive samples longer. And the rate higher. And let me, all in all, go to higher regions. Now the clock rate is remarkably higher than before. And I turn the rate of the LFO down. Now we have that pitch development up to down. Also nice. And up the rate. quite irregular again. If the sample and hold clock is equal to the length of the cycle of the LFO saw wave, or any other regular sample source in general, then we get only one and the same level out of the sample and hold unit, more or less, of course, with some analog irregularities. The same thing happens with the clock being twice the cycle length, or 3 times the cycle length, or 4 times the cycle length, and so on. When I say clock, I mean the time between 2 consecutive samples, or between 2 consecutively taken samples. When the clock of the sample and hold unit is about 3 times faster, meaning the time between taking 2 consecutive samples is about 1/3 of the cycle length of the LFO saw wave, then we get a kind of upwards arpeggio with suitable phase relations. In the animation, the sample and hold taking samples and the LFO cycle are in sync, are in phase. With other phase relations, we get at least parts of the pitch sequence sounding like an upwards arpeggio. When the time between taking samples is about 75% of the LFO cycle length, and the phase relation between sample clock and LFO wave is about 1:1, both are more or less in sync, and then we get the opposite. We get a downwards arpeggio. These are, of course, only a few examples, but you'll surely understand the principle by now and the meaning of phase relation and of relation of the frequencies between sample source and sample and hold clock. These are, of course, only a few examples I told you. Playing around with the different clock ratios and different LFO frequencies, or modulating both, or one of them, in a sensible way, in a compositional way, let me talk it like this, tell it like that, say it like that, that gives us a wide range of control without losing the notion of randomness. So let me mess around with different waveforms now. Different waveforms of the LFO at different rates, LFO and the clock rate, clock frequency. And additionally, I use now the attenuator again and try to find some nice sequences. So the first thing what I'm trying is a square wave, and so we should have more or less only 2 different levels, output levels of the random voltage module, so only two different pitches. Yeah, about. With some analog inaccuracy, of course. Yeah. All right, let's skip the down flank and go, or the saw wave, the down ramp, and go to a pure triangle wave. Now we have a pure triangle wave. Ah, nice. Exactly mirroring, the pitch is exactly mirroring the triangle wave with this frequency to clock relation. Nearly no steps audible with a high clock rate. So I'm increasing the rate, the spectrum of possible output levels. Now the attenuator is completely turned up. Very low LFO rate and a quite high, I'm in the high range here, quite high clock rate. Let me go down. With the clock rate and go up with the rate at the LFO. Higher clock rate a bit. And reduce the range of possible levels, possible output levels on here on the sample and hold unit. Irregular everything now. Now a little bit of regularity comes in when I increase the rate of the LFO, because I've also again a quite high rate here at the sample and hold unit, which I reduce now. A little bit faster. And a little bit of higher range. Faster. Okay, let's go to sine wave. Reduce the range of possible outputs again. Reduce, no, not that much. Yeah, that's better. Reduce the clock and decrease the rate of the LFO. Now I can increase the clock rate further on. And now the pitch as we hear, the pitch development answers exactly the shape of the LFO. All right, I think you've got the principle. Now, let's go on. Some of you might know that I don't only produce videos like the one you are watching right now. I'm also a writer and publisher of ebooks. Ebooks which always contain also a lot of video documentations about what each chapter is about. You'll find my ebooks about modular synthesis and the ones about granular synthesis and granular sound processing, and ebooks about certain synths and so on at my website, following the links down in the description, or there should be an info card visible up there right now. With the little switch next to the red manual sample button, I can turn the internal clock on and off. Pushing the red sample button lets me take a single sample manually. I can do so even with the internal clock turned on, but it will make more sense with the internal clock turned off most of the times. Well, let me do so. I've switched the internal clock off. Let me switch it on. Now I switch it off again. And I'm using only the internal noise generator here. And I take samples just by putting this red button. Okay, and I can leave it. I can push it and hold it as long as I want. Now I do so. No new sample will be generated until I push the button again. Holding it, nothing happens. Pushing it again. All right. I can trigger the samples using external signals. Let me do so. I use the gate output of my key step here and patch it into the sample in. The labeling is a little bit misleading. Sample is not, of course, the source which I take the samples from or which this unit takes the samples from. This source is fed into external in, as we know already. Sample is just the moment when to take a sample, and it's only the up flank of this key step gate which generates a sample. So let me, and of course it's independent from which key I hit. It's just generating the gate signal going to the sample and hold unit. I can start the sequencer. And again, it's not the nodes I have programmed in this sequencer. Each gate is a new gate impulse, makes the sample and hold unit take a new sample. And I can, of course, now I can use the functionality of my key step to influence the sample frequency here. Let me make it faster. More slowly. Different bar rates. And so on, and so on. All these functions I have, not all these functions I have shown you work only this way when this little switch here is switched to trigger. More about that in a minute or two. We have seen a lot of flexibility so far. We can use the internal noise source to take samples from. We can use any kind of external sources to take samples from, regular ones, regular sources, as well as non-repeating wave shapes. We can do both and adjust the share of internal and external sources. Concerning the clock, we can use the internal clock with adjustable rates. We can use a couple of different external clock signals, and we can use both internal and external. But there's even more functionality concerning clock rates. We can modulate the clock rate using the FM-in jack and its connected attenuator. Of course, there are also other sample targets, not only pitch information for oscillators, for VCOs, but for example, the cutoff frequency of a filter. I leave the patch as it is, modulating the sample and hold unit, which we have used so far in this video, modulating the pitch of the oscillator. But I make use of the fact that this module has two sample and hold units, two independent ones. More about this in a minute or two. So I use the second one to modulate the filter frequency. Take the output filter, the output from the low-pass filter, and feed the output of the oscillator, the VCO, to the input of the filter. And now I can change the clock rate of only this right sample and hold unit, which is modulating the filter. Let me make it faster. Very fast. Now the cutoff frequency here is modulated faster than the pitch of the oscillator, the VCO. A lot faster. Slowly. And the pitch faster. And so on and so on. I can, for example, of course, use one and the same sample and hold unit sample and hold unit, or the left one or the right one, to modulate both when I insert a multiple. But then I lose the possibility of using different clock frequencies for the random signals coming out. Well, some words about the second unit here, the right one called Unit B. This unit is completely the same in functionality as Unit A, and it's completely independent from Unit A. Well, completely is not really correct, because there is this little switch here. This little switch, which makes the internal clock of Unit A trigger Unit B. So what we hear at the moment is the sequencer here, my key step. Let me stop it. So I switch on the internal clock of Unit B. And now additionally, oh no, I switch it off. Now I switch on the internal clock of Unit A. It's going faster. And now both. Now I get some more complex rhythms a bit. And now I add the third trigger signal, the external one here, coming from my key step. I start the sequencer. And now I have 3 different trigger sources for the clock, causing the right unit, the Unit B, to take samples at quite complex rhythms. And again, of course, with the key step here, I can change the speed of one of these 3 trigger signals. Okay. Let me switch it off, the key step. Let me switch off. No, I leave it on. Unit A, the internal clock of Unit A, because I want to show you 2 things which are important. The position of the leftmost switch here, with which I switch on and off the internal clock of A, works only on Unit A, only on the left one. So let me even switch off the internal clock of Unit B now. And now Unit B is triggered only by Unit A, by the internal clock of Unit A, which I switch off, which is switched off right now, by the way. And switching on, switching off, no effect, because this switch works only on Unit A. So this switch switches on and off the internal clock of Unit A only for Unit A. The connection to Unit B is still active, even with this switched off. And another fact, just to mention, feeding in an external trigger, a trigger signal here in the external trigger input of Unit A does not work or does not cause anything on Unit B. So signals coming in here do not at all go through to Unit B. So we have only 3, not only, I think it's quite a lot, 3 different possible trigger signals which we can use at the same time. So let me do so again. I switch on the internal clock of Unit B. Now we have both internal clocks triggering the right Unit B, and now the third coming from the key step sequencer. All right. I mentioned the trigger gate switch some minutes ago. The typical way a sample and hold module works is taking a quick sample when a trigger impulse arrives, then holding the level until the next trigger impulse makes the unit take a new sample. All goings on in the sample source between 2 consecutive trigger impulses stay disregarded. This is the way our module 1036 works when the switch is set to trigger mode. In gate mode, the levels of the module's output change according to the levels in the sample source, as long as the level at the sample input jack is high. The switch doesn't have any influence on the behavior of the internal clock. The internal clock always generates the classic sample and hold effects as if the switch was always in trigger position, no matter what its position really is. Let me show this using my key step sequencer again. Let me stop it at first. As a trigger for the sample and hold unit. Oh well, let's make it on. The switch I'm talking about is now adjusted to trigger, and now I change it to gate. And now we hear that during the period, the high period of the gate signal, the development of the LFO here, which is used as a sound source, for the sample, that the development of the LFO here is heard during the period of the high period of the gate signal. Let me, for a moment, switch the sequencer off again here and push the red sample button. And you see and hear it works the same like in trigger. In trigger mode, this switch doesn't have any influence on this sample button, on the behavior of this sample button. Okay, let me switch the sequencer on again. So now the gate signals are flowing through the sample and hold unit. And now let me try different relations of the LFO rate, the speed of the sequencer, and the clock rate of this sample and hold unit. Increasing the speed of the sequencer and increasing the LFO speed. Just to compare again, back to trigger. Now we see, hey, what's that? The frequency, the adjusted frequency of the clock, of the internal clock here, doesn't have any influence either. Okay? So, again, different frequency relations, sequencer and LFO. When I say the speed of the sequencer, I'm saying the length of the high period of the gate signal. And why not changing the wave shape of the LFO? And making the sequencer faster again. Let me remind you that the nodes, which I have programmed here in the sequencer, are of no meaning at all. It's only the series of gate signals coming out from the sequencer. Reducing the LFO's rate. Once again, comparing to trigger mode. Let me go to some extremes. So both rates are high, the LFO rate as well as the as the sequencer's rate, and back to the mixture of sine and triangle wave, reducing the LFO's rate, as well as the speed of the sequencer. Okay, I think you've got what the possibilities you have with the different shapes of the sample source and different speeds. Well, of course this knob has no influence because the internal clock is switched off. So let me switch it on now and you hear a remarkable difference. Periods of glides and periods of short stepped notes. We have periods of glides and then follow a period of short step notes and then periods of glides again. So the periods of glides are the time, or we hear the periods of glides at the time when the gate signal is high, which is quite a long time high here because I have low speed of the sequencer. And the short step notes we hear when the period is low, when the gate signal level is low, and only the internal clock of the sample and hold unit works, which is, as I told you, always working in trigger mode. So when we have the relation, quite slowly running sequencer, or a quite low frequency of gate signals, and quite high, or at least remarkably higher frequency of the clock. Let me change this. Now we have only here and there a short stepped note. Now we have more step notes. Let me change the frequency of the LFO. Now we hear the difference between stepped note, periods of stepped notes, and periods of glides more clearly. Let me make it slow. Yeah, this is okay. Now I increase the frequency of the speed of the sequencer. But it's more interesting with longer periods of high gate levels. Which means also longer periods of low gate levels, of course, and during the low gate levels we hear only the internal clock of the sample and hold unit in action. The red manual button is, just like the internal clock, not impressed at all by the position of the trigger gate switch. It always delivers only short triggers. This is part 6 of my series of videos about the ARP 2500. Parts 4 and 5 are non-public. The last one, part 5, is called the ARP 2500 Show, not only because it's more than 4 hours long, but also because there is a lot more than just a bunch of information about the multimode filter and the resonator module 1047 in this video. You'll find a couple of background information about the ARP 2500 and about ARP in general there, as well as some less common things like, for example, combining literature and modular synthesis, and a lot more. There should be an info card up there now, otherwise you'll find the link to the ARP 2500 show down in the description. Well, let me make use of this gate functionality in a completely different way. At first, I'll explain the patch to you. Here from this cassette tape player, the sound goes into the external in and serves as the sample source. The sample trigger comes still from my from my Arturia key step, and the output of the sample and hold module I have patched directly into my mixer here. Don't bother about these wrong labelings here. So once again, cassette deck, tape deck, into sample and hold unit where it serves as sample source, triggering the sample from my Arturia key step here, and the output does not go into any module to modulate pitch or filter frequency, but goes directly into the main studio mixer. And now I start the tape deck, and when I hit the key, then I make it louder. We hear what comes from the tape deck. We sample the sound from the tape deck. Let me do it using the sequencer. Make it faster. Even faster. Less fast. Instead of triggering the sample and hold unit with the tape deck, I do something else. I trigger it with the output of the LFO here, of the Behringer's LFO, which itself is modulated by the Moog Workstatt's LFO. Okay. Let's make the modulation faster. So the LFO rate here is modulated by the LFO of the Moog Workstatt. Let's make it fast and slowly. And I have patched the signal, the modulating signal of the Moog Workstatt's LFO. I've patched it through an attenuator. Now I increase the intensity of modulating this LFO. This LFO of the neutron, which delivers the trigger signals for the sample and hold. So the rate of speeds of the LFO is lower now. Make the basic rate higher. Make it extreme. Modulation rate extreme. Then we enter the region of noise. Make the basic rate of the LFO slow. And the same with the modulating LFO. The LFO modulating the LFO which delivers the trigger signal. Let's give the modulation the full strength by turning up the attenuator. And and reducing the strength of the modulating. By the way, the recording here, which is playing from the tape deck, is a collection of different voices recorded at different places and different people from different people. All right, you can use, of course, every signal, every audio signal to serve. Can make every audio signal to serve as a sample source and tweak it and squeeze it and destroy it this way. So here the sample and hold unit serves as well as an audio sampler. Let me talk about something completely different. We all know, of course, that each note on the scale corresponds to a certain voltage, which I can get here from my key step at the pitch output. And I will make use of this voltage in the following way. I have switched the sample and hold unit back to trigger. I'm going to use only the internal clock, but not the internal noise sound source. The pitch information coming from the Arturia shall serve as the source where the sample and hold unit takes its samples from. I have programmed a simple sequence here. Let's at first listen to this sequence. So what we now hear is coming directly here from the neutron. The sample and hold unit is not involved at all. So this is the sequence. These are the pitches which I have programmed. And now let's listen to what the sample and hold unit does from it. So these pitch information, the voltage, let me make it a little bit less loud at the moment. So the voltage corresponding to certain pitches, which I have programmed here in the sequencer, goes into the external in, meaning serves as the source where the sample is taken from. So it's not the audio from the neutron which the samples are taken from, but it's the pure control voltage which the samples are taken from. And by doing this way, I get only notes, I get only pitches out of the sample and hold unit which belong to the scale or which belong to the tune which I have programmed here in the sequencer. But the order of the notes is different, is random according to the relation speed of the sequencer and clock rate. So let me change the clock rate. And by the way, of course, the sounds are different because I have not adjusted the same, not even the same basic tuning of these two oscillators, what we have heard, the neutron and the ARP 2500 one. And I've switched on the simple square wave here, so without filtering and so on. So the sound, the timbre is different, but the notes, the tune itself, which reaches the sample and hold unit, is the same. So I'll be silent now and change sample rate as well as, not sample rate, the clock rate, as well as the speed of the sequencer here. All right, so this way we can destroy every melody, make the notes of a certain scale randomly appear. So I can program a sequence containing the notes of all notes of a certain scale, use the pitch information, the pitch CV from this sequence to feed in the sample and hold, and then I can mess around with the different speeds. Let's talk about some compositional aspects for a minute. It's not only when making generative music that we have to be aware of, among other things, the following two facts. First, randomness brings variety and color to the piece we are working on, but also purely random sonic events get boring quite fast, and the listeners turn their attention elsewhere after a shocking short number of seconds, their attention and their inclination to buy our next track. The solution is structure. And to all of you who worship randomness, I say, well, imposing structure on randomly happening sonic events does not mean losing randomness. Not at all. I have written a whole ebook about making generative music, 323 pages of know-how, plus some hours of embedded video. There should be an info card containing the link to it up there now, otherwise you'll find the link to it down in the descriptions too. Back to our module 1036. One way to give our randomness a bit of structure is bringing variations, rhythmical variations, to the rate of the internal clock. The module 1036 offers even a function to do so, the input jack called FM in and its attached attenuator. And when we want to increase randomness without losing structure, more or less the same thought the other way around, we can use the second sample and hold unit of the module and feed it in the FM in jack to randomize the structure, the modulation of the internal clock rate. Well, let me do so. I take the LFO output from my neutron and patch it into the FM in of the sample and hold unit. Let me make it a little bit louder. Now I have chosen the sine wave shape of the LFO. Let me change this to saw or down ramp. ARP to square. Let's make the rate of the LFO a little bit faster. And the basic clock rate slower. And let's go to a mixture of sine wave and triangle to the LFO. The rate faster, the LFO's rate faster. Even faster, and of course I can change the amount of modulation with this potentiometer. Well, I think it's more interesting with a faster basic clock rate. The faster I adjust the LFOs, the modulating oscillators rate, the less structure is noticeable, so I go down again. Alright, so the other thing is, I told about it already. Let me change this. So now no clock modulation at all. Now I take the second, right unit, sample and hold unit, and use it to modulate randomly the clock rate. And I can change them, of course, the strength of the internal random signal of the modulating sample and hold unit, as well as of the modulated one. Let me change this again back to maximum strength at the modulator, and I can reduce the influence of this right unit by reducing the clock frequency modulation amount here. There is structure now, but the structure is, of course, the lower I put the amount here, the structure is less and less important, less and less noticeable. Let me put it up again. Surely I can now mess around with the different relations of the two clocks here. I can even use the clock of modulator A, of sample and hold unit A here to additionally modulate the unit B on the right side. Alright, let me remind you to visit my website from time to time. It's not only because you'll find all non-public videos of our Rofil media community there. There are also special sales actions going on at the site each week. And the most recent news about the goings-on in the community, about special services for artists and so on, are also published at https and so on, dev rofilm-medianet. There should be an info card up there containing the link to the site, and otherwise you'll find the link down in the description anyway. Time to have a look at how the original ARP 2500 from 1970 worked and looked like. I use the software version called G2500. It's 100% authentic, so I can demonstrate the workflow of 1970. You'll find a link to this software down in the description. And even if those of you who have watched part 5 of this series already know the basic structure of the vintage synth, I'm going to explain it again today, because there will be a lot of you who have bought 3 bars of chocolate rather than the 4-hour non-public video containing part 5. The original ARP worked with matrix switches above and below the modules. The lowest of the 20 rows below the modules, row 20, is pre-patched to the main audio out of the machine. Rows 1, 11, 12 and 13 of the matrix above the modules are also reserved to certain functions. Rows 1 to 10 and 14 to 20 above, as well as rows 1 to 19 below, are free to be used for patching, well, switching the modules according to the creative will of the user. The blank space in the middle is a blank contact, no contact, not link at all. It's the resting position of the switches. There are little arrows on top and at the bottom of each module indicating whether the switch above or below the module belongs to an output or an input, and to which one, of course. Well, let's go and make a simple patch. I switch the output of the oscillator module 1004T to the main audio out. So then I switch the input, use this slider, to row number 10. I could use any other of these rows here or of these rows below, except for except for row 20. And I switch the output of the sample and hold unit. I use only the left same row, number 10. Then I switch, I turn the internal random clock, not random clock, the internal sample source on, increase the speed and switch the internal clock on. And now I can attenuate the influence of the sample and hold unit by attenuating the input here, or increasing it. Change the clock, right, and so on. Sample manually, and you know all these functions. So this is the simple principle using the switches. This row here connects the output of the sample and hold unit to the input of the frequency modulation here, and this row, this and this switch connects the output, connects the sound to the main, to row 20, to the main audio out. The functionality of the G2500 is 100% authentic. I told you already. Everything is authentic. The matrix switches, the knobs and the switches on the front panels, the inputs and outputs, everything is like with the original. And therefore, I take the G2500 together with a copy of the original manual from 1970 to find out in what the Behringer hardware is different, is not authentical. And I'll do the same with Cherry Audio's software version in their voltage modular VST synth. Besides the difference between switching and using patch cables, of course. There are only two differences, one of which is a major difference. The original ARP 2500 module 1036 has 4 separate outputs, 2 from each of the sample and hold units, where the pulses from the internal clocks are let out. The Behringer clone doesn't have any. This makes it impossible to use the internal clocks to trigger other events in the whole patch synchronously. We will have to use external triggers more often, therefore. The Behringer clone has got 1 output per sample and hold unit. The original has got 2. Behringer has 1 external signal input, 1 sample trigger input, and 1 clock rate modulation input per unit. The original from 1970 has got 2 of each. And these are all the differences. All in all, we can say that the Behringer hardware version is a quite authentic, let's say, translation of the original module into the Eurorec world. All right, so far the hardware. But what about Cherry Audio's voltage modular software version of the ARP 2500, especially the module 1036? Well, long story told in short. It's not even a long story. Here the module has got at least 1 clock out jack per unit. I think this is a major advantage over the Behringer hardware, because now I can, same as with the original hardware and the G2500 software, I can use the internal clocks of the sample and hold units to trigger events all over my whole patch synchronously to the random events caused by the module 1036 using its internal clock. The slightly different layout of the front panel is not of importance, I think. Cherry Audio has put the clock rate modulation, the input jacks and the potentiometers on top of the module instead of the button. The lower numbers of inputs and outputs, lower compared to the original from 1970, are not of importance at all here, because I can use each input and output more than only once in the software. All in all, we can say that Voltage Modular beats Behringer's hardware in only one point, but one quite important point when it comes to authenticity. Well, dear friends, watchers, subscribers, followers and supporters, we have reached the end of this video. But not the end of the series about the ARP 2500 and its hardware and software clones. Only 2 more videos about certain modules are to come before there will be a whole and long video about patching and patches using the ARP 2500 modules. And after this video, A couple of further videos about certain modules will follow. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to do what I asked you for at the beginning and enjoy your day. Your Rolf Kasten from the Rofil Media Community.